the Straits of Singapore is in fact another critical choke point. You may be aware that in fact if you add up all the maritime oil, crude and refined, you might be surprised that actually more flows through the Straits of Malacca and Singapore than even the Straits of Hormuz. This is a right. Freedom of navigation as a right and not a privilege for ships and planes. And this is of profound importance to Singapore.
Following the outbreak of the US-Iran conflict, Iran's blockade of the Strait of Hormuz has triggered a new oil crisis and renewed recognition of the value of geopolitical choke points. Indeed, there is another choke point closer to home, and for decades, American war planners have called the Strait of Malacca as posing a so-called Malacca dilemma for China. About 80% China's crude oil imports passes through the Strait of Malacca, and an Indonesian official has recently said that they should also set up a toll booth for traffic going through the very strait as well. So will this raise alarm bells for China's energy security? And also, how are Southeast Asian countries managing risk of military escalation and sky-high oil prices from the Iran war spillovers? Finally, a new survey released last month shows that Southeast Asian nations now prefer China over the US. Why, and why is it happening now? Hello, everybody, and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Wen-Ti. To unpack these issues and more, I'm joined by Professor Cai Rongxiang, Professor of Political Science at National Chongqing University. And joining us online is Joseph Cristanto from Singapore, who is a Maritime Security Research Analyst at RSIS at NTU. Thank you, Joseph. Thank you, Professor Cai, both for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
All right, let's jump right in. I want to start with you, Professor Cai. So can you give us an overview? Why is Strait of Malacca receiving renewed attention right now? Is it just spillover from instability from the Iran war, or did it say something bigger about the global order today?
I think on the one hand, it is a spillover effect because the Strait of Hormuz right now faces instability and disruption. So the pressure doesn't just disappear, and it moves elsewhere. So the thing is that the Strait of Malacca has apparently shifted from being a simple trade route into a contested strategic asset. So because for a lot of shippers and governments, the Strait of Malacca is the shortcut, right? It is the straightest line between the Indian Ocean to Pacific Ocean. So you want to drive through a highway, right? You don't want to drive through to a time and money-consuming local ways. So this is the key point for the Strait of Malacca after Strait of Hormuz has been blockaded, right? Something like that.
All right, and so following up on that point, I might come to Joseph for my next question, which is this lens about Strait of Malacca shifting from a commercial corridor and more into a potential choke point strategically. How was your take on this?
Yeah, I would say the renewed focus on the Strait of Malacca itself, it's caused by both the short-term trigger and a longer-term structural issue, like the professor had said before. So in the short term, of course, the instability in the Middle East raises concerns about global energy flows, but then it also structurally highlights the fragility of the global maritime trade network itself. With Southeast Asia, sits at the receiving end of these flows, so disruptions upstream quickly translate into economic and strategic concerns for the region. Not just Southeast Asia, but also like countries in Northeast Asia that also depends on the Strait of Malacca for their energy supplies. I think it's also very important that to recognize that these choke points are not isolated in the first place, right? So disruptions in one area, especially around energy flows, can quickly have a downstream effects on routes leading toward Asia, including the Strait of Malacca and Singapore.
All right, and naturally, just to talk about that proposal from Indonesian officials, Professor Cai, when they suggested that it should charge vessels traveling through the Strait of Malacca, that suggestion was quickly, of course, downplayed, if not shut down by other officials, be it Jakarta, be it Singapore, be it Malaysia. But I think potentially one could argue that the genie has been let out of a bottle, if you will, that is no longer completely taken for granted, that passage through will be unconditional. So in this much more user pay model, do you see it being viable going forward? And do you see any pushbacks coming up?
I think the proposal to set up toll boost for ships passing through the Strait of Malacca, I think it hit a major nerve, especially to Malaysia and Singapore, because it doesn't make any sense, because according to UNCLOS, it is kind of like a principle of we call customary international law, because freedom of navigation is very important, especially the Strait of Malacca. Actually, it's not a canal. It's not a canal, it's the international waterways. So you cannot collect fees, you know? And also sometimes if you collect too much money, it's kind of like a rip-off, right? So it doesn't make any sense to do this kind of thing, even though it's just a proposal, but it will have a lot of pushbacks, especially from the Malaysian side and the Singapore side.
All right, okay, so international waters, passage through should still be seen as a right rather than a pay-for privilege, isn't it?
Yes.
How about you, Joseph? Do you find that any alternative to the Strait of Malacca coming out? Like if this gets more serious, will other countries in the region, perhaps beyond, begin to think about finding a plan B, maybe developing other land or other sea routes to serve the same purpose for that international commercial traffic?
Yeah, but sure, but it does present a challenge, right? The idea of, suddenly one of the coastal states surrounding the Strait of Malacca wants to actually impose a toll on the Strait of Malacca itself. But I think geography and cost efficiency at the end of the day will still strongly favor the Strait of Malacca, and alternative routes such as the much talked about Kra-Isthmus land bridge. They do tend to gain attention during periods of disruptions, but then again, they still cannot defeat the cost efficiency of going through the Strait of Malacca. So what we are more likely to see in the future is that countries will try to diversify their trade routes in a sense, but they won't replace the Strait of Malacca outright. And also going back to the whole Indonesian toll proposal thing, right? I agree with the professor that it's unthinkable, and I don't think it will be implemented in the near term or even in the medium term as well. I think it's worth remembering that the Strait of Malacca operates in a completely different regime compared to the Strait of Hormuz. So in the Strait of Hormuz, you have a hostile coastal state, in this case Iran, who is trying to they didn't even ratify the UNCLOS, right? So they're always trying to nationalize the Strait of Hormuz to try to impose a toll on the Strait of Hormuz. We have a completely different maritime regime in the Strait of Malacca, which is governed by the transit passage regime, and also the coastal states in the Strait of Malacca, even in Indonesia itself, benefited hugely from keeping the strait itself open.
All right, so that's reassuring to know that I guess international waters, rite of passage, sounds like it will remain very viable in Southeast Asia for quite a while to come. So I want to switch gear to another topic, and that is more economic side of the Iran war and how may impact on Southeast Asia. The outbreak of the Iran war, of course, has dealt a severe shock to countries around the world, and Southeast Asia is no exemption to that broader pattern. Disruption to energy supply means surging oil prices and more complicated logistics. And even if the Iran war were to come to an end tomorrow, oil prices, infrastructure, and production levels, they are not likely to return to pre-war levels overnight either. So Singapore's Prime Minister Lawrence Wong himself has expressed concern about these developments as well. Take a look.
Oil prices have risen by more than 60% since the war started. Supply chains are under strain and countries everywhere are feeling the squeeze. Asia is particularly exposed because a substantial share of energy supplies passing through the Strait of Hormuz is bound for our region, even after the US eventually ends its military campaign. The geopolitical situation in the Middle East will have been adversely affected. We are entering a more uncertain and unstable phase. with wide-ranging implications for regional security and global energy flows.
Professor Tsai, how severe do you find the economic impact of oil price volatility that's triggered by the Iran war is on Southeast Asian nations in recent months?
I think the impact is very amazing because many South East Asian countries, because they try to import a lot of oil, right, to keep their economies running. But especially when the tensions between U.S. and Iran caused global oil prices to almost double, and fivefold for oil prices in some southeastern countries. So it created a chain reaction, especially when the U.S. and Iran have a fever, and Southeast Asia feels the chill, right? So this is so important. Why Prime Minister from Singapore, he said this is a global crisis, not only to Middle East countries, also for the Southeast Asian countries as well, right? So this is so important.
All right, and what's your sense, Joseph? How do you find these rising oil prices, these higher insurance premiums, this more supply chain disruption? How are they testing the economic resiliency and social stability, if you will, of Southeast Asian economies in recent months?
Yeah, I think they are testing the Southeast Asian economies quite severely these days in recent months, right? Especially since the impact extends beyond just fuel prices. So, for example, in Indonesia, right, rising crude prices already place a lot of direct pressure on the state budget due to fuel subsidies, which remains politically sensitive. For example, I think barely 3 months ago, the government only spent like about 400 rupiah per liter in terms of subsidy to maintain the price point at an affordable level for the Indonesian people, right? But just last week, it has jumped to more than 6,000 rupiah per liter. So that's a huge jump in subsidy, like more than 10 times jump in subsidies in a sense, right? So this do create a difficult trade-off between this government maintaining their fiscal sustainability, but at the same time also ensuring social stability. This doesn't just affect the government in a sense, right? It also translated into increased transportation costs, increased logistics costs, and also electricity bills. For example, in Singapore, a lot of the electricity is generated by natural gas powered electric plants, right? So of course, due to the increase in price of LNGs, the price of electricity is also increased, which then eventually all these stuff conspire to affect food prices and the overall cost of living that countries, people in Southeast Asia gonna experience in a sense, right?
And Joseph, if I may follow up on that, so economic challenges for Southeast Asia for sure, then in addition, or rather in response to the challenges though, what do you think are some of the measures or tools that local governments or regional governments have been trying to mitigate or to manage these challenges? And are they working?
Yeah. Yeah, so most Southeast Asian governments, they rely on a mix of subsidies, fuel subsidies. They also try to diversify their fuel import sources. So, for example, some countries like Indonesia and the Philippines, they are now trying to import fuel from Russia, thanks to the sanction exemptions that the U.S. that Washington has decided on this issue to help reduce the oil prices, and also digging into our strategic reserve as well. However, the effectiveness of all these measures varies depending on each country's fiscal capacity. So, wealthier economy like Singapore probably are generally better able to absorb the shocks, since the government have, deeper pockets, to actually, subsidize and help reduce the pressure on everyday Singaporeans, in a sense, right? But then, though the still developing economies like Indonesia, the Philippines, we are faced with a much more difficult trade-offs in that sense. So yeah, but in this scenario, regional cooperation should be something that we pursue in a sense, but sadly it still remains relatively limited, mainly because of the lack of political will across Southeast Asia to actually use the ASEAN mechanism to coordinate on this energy security issue.
All right, so sounds like some collective action challenges remain there. And one thing you mentioned that caught my eye was how you talk about some regional countries are beginning to consider buying Russian oil. And I think that speaks to more geopolitical ramifications for the Iran war that's beyond just the economic side. And so let me show you an example here. In a rare public rebuke, Thailand's foreign minister criticized the U.S. for unleashing the Iran war, but hasn't really helped out regional countries all that much with managing the war's impact on them. So in the interview with the Washington Post, the Thai foreign minister stated that the U.S. haven't come out to talk to us about how they can help. They haven't approached us directly saying, oh, we understand that you have to endure the impact and we can help you out. So I want to ask Professor Tsai, how do you think Southeast Asia is feeling at the moment about the U.S. judging from this?
Yeah, because for a lot of countries in Southeast Asia, because the oil crisis is like burning candles between eyebrows, right? So they are supposed to diversify, try to lessen the crisis. Maybe they have to buy some other oil instead of the oil coming from the Middle East. But for Thailand, they are not looking for to replace the U.S. security umbrella because they are pursuing hedging, but not living. So this is very, very important because for Thailand, their foreign policy is bamboo diplomacy. What's that? Because you have to sort of bend with the wind, but you have to maintain balance. So this is not a sign of abandoning Washington for good, but it's kind of like a sign to maximize benefits because they are facing imminent threat right now. So they have to deal with that, but they are not gonna, give up the whole structure, especially for U.S. and Thailand security pact, something like that. Yeah.
All right. And Joseph, do you think that is a symbol of, I guess, number one, do you think that sentiment is widely shared among regional countries, number one? And number two, is it more like a short-term event, or does it speak to a longer-term structural shift or a bigger story about U.S. willingness or ability to deliver and help out the regional development?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of both here in play, right? That statement, it reflects the short-term frustration at the U.S. because of not consulting its supposed allies and partners in this region whenever it's about to take action that will impact, say, Thailand allies and partners in the region, right? And it's important to note that Thailand is actually like a treaty ally of the U.S. as well. They have a mutual defense treaty, right? But it also speaks to the longer-term concerns about U.S. strategic reliability. There is a growing perception that the U.S. is managing multiple crises simultaneously right now, which then raises question about the consistency of its engagement in Southeast Asia, especially since the U.S. seems to be more focused on its own hemisphere in the Middle East and Europe, right? So where does that put Southeast Asia in Washington's plate, in a sense, right? So, and I think it's also important to note that U.S. presence in Southeast Asia is quite, one can say it's discretionary in a sense, right? Because the U.S. can just pull out of Southeast Asia anytime they want. On the other hand, you have the other elephant in the room. You have China, right? And Beijing's presence in Southeast Asia is permanent because of the simple geographical proximity to Southeast Asia, right? So, in this case, for countries in Southeast Asia who are trying to hedge between the two superpowers, any signs of U.S. withdrawal, in a sense, quote unquote, right, will always spark concerns among these regional countries, because certainly we don't want the US to leave, because that then will leave China as the only preeminent power in this region. But then again, whether or not US can actually commit it permanently in this region, that's also a big question as well.
So on that point, I think you point out how Southeast Asia's choice isn't between the two big superpowers that have role in the region, namely US and China. And this is where I think one recent poll that came out in April last month was quite of interest here. There's ISEAS, a think tank in Singapore. They just did a survey on the state of Southeast Asia 2026, which showed that China has now taken over the US as Southeast Asia's preferred superpower. Professor Tsai, tell us what's going on and how should we read it?
Yeah, because they have some pushbacks, especially for the inconsistency from U.S. President Donald Trump. But the thing is that economically, maybe they can have that kind of hedging policy because they can cooperate with China, especially on economies. But the thing is that at the same time, they are facing a security problem with China because we know South China Sea maritime disputes. So it's kind of like you cannot put all your eggs in the same basket. But the thing is that the Chinese economy is not very good. Before, they can offer a lot of assistance, right? But right now, their economy is going down. So I don't think they can be over-dependent to China as well, because China is going to flood a lot of their products into their markets. So for ASEAN countries, maybe it's kind of like you have to be cautious.
I want to come back to Joseph about more of a regional perspective. If at the moment when China's charm offensive, if you will, is seen to be having some effect, judging from the polls, and the moment when U.S.'s own popularity seems to be declining somewhat in the Southeast Asian region, how do you think China is taking advantage of this moment, or is it?
Yeah, China may seek to capitalize on this perception by presenting itself as a more stable, more reliable economic partner, right? Particularly through trade and infrastructure engagements. You have like all the infrastructure investment that China has made in this region. However, I would hesitate to say that China is replacing the United States in this region. I mean, most Southeast Asian states will continue to prefer to hedge and maintaining relationships with both rather than aligning fully with either one of them. Historically, preference for the US is much higher compared to China, right? From 2020 to 2023, for example, preference for the US is like, for most of the time, above the in high 50s or even like low 60% mark compared to China. So this dip in US, in the preference of Southeast Asian countries towards the US, can only see it like happening after the Israeli attack on Gaza in 2023, right? So there's that, but even after that, and after all the tariffs, for some reason, the US still managed to achieve 47% or something in the survey about what the Southeast Asians think about what Southeast Asia should do in the face of these competing superpowers. More than 70% of the respondents would rather enhance ASEAN's resilience and unity and not siding with either power. So there's that. It's not the increase in China's preference is not because of China's charm offensive is making any dent in a sense, but it's more because of other structural factors that actually affect Southeast Asian perceptions towards the US.
All right, bigger structural factors. Speaking of China's charm offensive, Professor Tai, are regional countries buying it in your view, and should they buy it?
Sometimes they cannot choose because they have to cooperate with China, especially China is one of their exporting markets. But the thing is that you have to be cautious, because in terms of maritime disputes, China doesn't care because they just claim this is our territory, right? So like Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, and Indonesia, they are all claimants of the South China Sea. So in this area, you cannot talk about just only economies, right? Trade, because you have to be focused on this kind of security dimension. This is very important for ASEAN countries because ASEAN is a big area, right? But the thing is that it's very hard for them to have that kind of collective, pushback to China. And China always wants to deal with each, individual country in a bilateral way. But this is not good because China is so big, right? So you cannot negotiate with China from a position of strength. That's the key issue here.
All right, on that note, that's about all the time we have. But I'd like to thank you, Joseph, for joining us. I'd like to thank you, of course, Professor Tai, for coming to the studio. That's our show, guys. Thank you for your tuning in. As always, come and check us out on YouTube. And until next time, it's good night from us from Taipei.